It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. This meeting is really interesting to me because I think it's the kind of meeting that should have happened in a lot of areas to support aquaculture from the beginning. I'm sort of going to talk about national challenges to US aquaculture from a perspective of what I've put on this slide, but also try to paint a picture of what I see as sort of a disconnect that's happening and has happened in the United States. By bringing this kind of group together to talk at this stage of development, I think is a way to maybe connect those dots before aquaculture gets too far down the road. So hopefully this will make sense as I get going. So decided to, rather than just paint a whole litany of challenges to US aquaculture, to kind of start off to talk a little bit about the reality of US aquaculture, but then talk about some of the perceptions that are very much part of the reality, and then maybe talk about some possibilities as well. So if we look at US aquaculture, and I think about US aquaculture, what I see, again, I said I was an economist, and what I see is we have one of the world's largest seafood markets right here. We live in one of the world's largest seafood markets. Yes, we're not a big seafood eating nation. We only eat, on average, 15.5 pounds per capita, and that's been basically level, statistically level, for a very long time. But we have a lot of people in this country, and we're relatively affluent. Without a doubt, we are one of the world's largest seafood markets, and the rest of the world knows it and targets us in a big-time way. So the market's here. We have tremendous expertise in raising fish in this country. We have fish farmers that are fourth-generation fish farmers. They're very good at what they do. They're very good at working with these animals, and we raise a tremendous diversity of different species all across the United States. Seafood consumers do like diversity, and we raise a lot of diversity on farms in the United States. So we're already doing this in the United States and have this kind of potential. We have production infrastructure in many places in the United States. We are doing what our new Secretary of Agriculture wants us to do, and doing it right. I think there's no question when you look at US aquaculture, we are doing it right. We're doing it in a way that's environmentally sustainable. We're producing a very healthy and safe product. I don't work for the industry. I'm not paid by them. I'm a scientist who spent an entire career studying this from a marketing and economics perspective. But I have spent a lot of time on farms across the United States raising aquaculture products. And so we really are involved in an industry that is doing it in a way that our consumers want. This chart, of course, is a Seafood Watch chart of best choices, but when you look at that chart, you can't help but see that the major sectors of US aquaculture are producing products like catfish, trout, hybrid striped bass, clams, and oysters that are all rated as best choices in terms of environmental sustainability. And when you look at the kinds of regulations that require safety and other things, we're producing a very safe product as well. So we are doing it right in the United States. We also have tremendous infrastructure. Everybody wants to come here and learn in the United States. We have the land-grant university system. We have the ARS system that Carole talked about. And so we have the resources in this country. We have the research infrastructure. We have the intellectual capacity in our universities and federal research institutions. We are the market. We have a big market. So what in the world is going on? When you look at this graph is showing, taking FAO data of the growth of world aquaculture. These are, each data point here is a 5-year growth rate of US aquaculture compared to the rest of the world. US aquaculture is this red line that's on the bottom. If you look at this, the blue line is world aquaculture on the top. The rate of growth of aquaculture in the United States has been consistently less than that of the rest of the world since about 1990. It's been negative since about the early 2000s down in here. It's become actually negative. So what in the world is going on? This is the kind of disconnect that I'm talking about that's happened in the United States. We can take a bit closer look at this. This graph is contrasting aquaculture by different categories from the 2005 Census of Aquaculture and the 2012 Census of Aquaculture reported by USDA. A lot of the decline is what's happened in the catfish industry down here. Catfish has been historically the largest segment of US aquaculture. I could spend a great deal of time talking about it. I continue to work very closely with this industry, and I've worked with the catfish industry for more than a quarter of a century. But essentially what has happened is that their success and their growth attracted competition, as successful industries and businesses do. They attracted competition primarily from Vietnam and from Vietnamese growers who are raising pangasius catfish in Vietnam under conditions that are not subject to the strict environmental regulations that we have in the United States, which is a major reason for why it's produced so much more cheaply than it can be in the United States. And so they've had to contend with this tremendous influx of a very low-priced product that has a tremendous amount to do with the lack of environmental enforcement and regulation in a country like Vietnam. Vietnam is also shipping a lot of shrimp over here, of course, under the same kind of conditions at a much lower price than what many people in the United States can raise it for. So this industry did struggle, and it's contracted. I do want to say, for the record, the industry has been profitable now for several years. There's new investment coming back into the catfish industry. At the Catfish Farmers of America annual convention, the processor panel that normally, I'm not sure I've ever heard them be positive about anything, and this year they were very, very positive. New accounts, new products are moving into different areas. They're seeing renewed demand for U.S. farm-raised catfish and other sorts of things. So the recovery is slow and the growth is slow, but there is some. So a lot of those statistics reflect catfish. But you also see that there's not been a lot of growth in trout, for example, another major segment of U.S. aquaculture, bait fish, ornamentals, and tropicals, and some others that have shown in the past very rapid rates of growth. We do see some interesting things like the other category. If you look at these data closely, you see things like sea vegetables appearing in the Census of Aquaculture in 2012 that never appeared before. There are people raising and selling kelp off the northeast coast of the United States and selling it as a vegetable product. You also see things like other food fish. Some of that growth is tilapia, and so we see some signs of growth in all of this. But overall, U.S. aquaculture has not lived up to its expectation, and I think it's a product of this kind of disconnect. I showed, if you look closely at that graph, you saw that there was some growth in mollusk production. We actually have a huge boom in demand for shellfish on the East Coast and on the West Coast. When you talk to shellfish growers, they will say that they can't even begin to meet that demand because of this curtain of regulations that's on the slide here. When you talk to a lot of fish farmers and aquaculture producers that have been around for a long time, this is what they describe, this total curtain of regulations. Now, I do want to make it very clear that when I talk to farmers about the regulatory compliance burden that they have to contend with, they are not complaining about the existence of the regulations. They want the same quality of environment and the same quality of food safety and the same quality of life that the rest of us want. What they are complaining about is the overlap, redundancy, and duplication is what they complain about. Just give you one example of interviews we did recently on the West Coast with shellfish growers. This one individual told me he has to take the same temperature measurements of the shellfish and the air and everything else, which he doesn't mind doing because it reflects on the health and safety of the product. What he does mind doing is that he has to record it on 3 different forms on the boat. He has to go back to his office, record it on 3 different forms in his computer, and send it to 3 different agencies after a long day on the water. He might get those confused and send the wrong one to the wrong one, and he has to do this every single week. He does mind sending this the exact same day to 3 different places every week on 3 different forms. So this is what they're talking about when they talk about the influence of regulations. This is what shellfish growers on the West Coast have to contend with to get a single permit or to change the kind of gear that they're using. This is the kind of process that they face. So this is why they say they cannot begin to meet the demand that's growing dramatically and exists. If you haven't been on the coast recently, there are designer oyster bars these days and designer oyster products that are named Naked Cowboy and the bowling ball oyster and all this crazy thing. But there's a boom in demand that is really amazing. So where do these regulations come from? Well, regulations come from lawmakers. That's who passes the laws in the United States. Why do lawmakers pass laws? They do it because their constituents ask them to. Regulators then are told they have to develop regulations for these different things. And so what we really get down to is this whole issue that is being called social license. But if you haven't read this kind of literature, it's really about the general approval on the part of society for people to do certain kinds of things. This is where I think we start to see this disconnect with aquaculture and what's going on, because in many parts of the United States, aquaculture is viewed in a very, very negative way due to different kinds of perceptions. These perceptions become reality. They encourage people and drive people to talk to their lawmakers to pass certain kinds of laws. Many of these perceptions are due to misinformation that's been spread about aquaculture, sometimes by very well-intended people who just don't do their homework, other times for agendas that are very, very different from what the ads and the newspaper articles are about, and I don't have time to go into that. But on the part of many NGOs who have put out a lot of this information, they tend to depict aquaculture as trying to pollute the water as much as we can and stick fish in it and try to make money out of it, maybe. These are simplistic, I understand. But just to give you, just kind of paint a little bit of this picture. A lot of government officials tend to view aquaculture as another industry. Industries must be regulated because all industries do pollute, so therefore they should be regulated. One quick story. Last fall, there was a fish farmer in a particular state. Farm had been around for nearly 100 years, third generation fish farmer. This is a fish farmer that shows up at every scientific meeting, pays attention to everything, has done his due diligence to try to abide by all of the laws, was in compliance with the laws of the state and the federal government, had a brand new inspector show up at the farm, walked around, looked at the farm, looked at what was going on, everything seemed fine. Next week this farmer gets a letter accusing him of being in violation of the Clean Water Act and a whole host of other things, in violation of permitting laws, subject to all kinds of fines, and unless this was corrected within a week, and there was no way to get any kind of permits within a week in that particular state anyway, even if he had been required, people were going to come out and arrest him. Well, long story short, the farm was in compliance with the state law. The farm was in compliance with federal law. The farm was not doing anything wrong. There was a brand new inspector who had a master's degree in education who had been working with troubled youths and had just been hired the week before and told to increase the number of permits issued because that particular state was under pressure from surrounding states by not doing enough to address an environmental issue that all the states wanted to address, is what happened. But this farmer had to spend time defending himself, had paid attorney fees, and had to have meetings with a lot of people. At the end of the day, they said, oops, yeah, you're right. The farmer was correct. But the farmer spent a lot of time on it. It comes out of these perceptions where these things sort of happen. I'll go out on a limb and say a lot of fish farmers see themselves as struggling to make a living in the United States in what has become an increasingly hostile environment. So you have different perceptions, and it's an issue. Some parts of the United States, like where I worked in Arkansas and Mississippi, their aquaculture industries are a point of pride. They're a point of pride with people. A lot of people know fish farmers, respect them, and know that these are respected individuals in their communities. It's not just because there are major industries in those states, though, because the state of Washington is the largest aquaculture producing state in the United States, and their social license is something that they're struggling with. A lot of people don't want to see a buoy out there in the waters off the coast of the state of Washington, regardless of the fact that shellfish industry spent a lot of money fighting some battles to try to clean up the water that was running off into the bays and estuaries out there, because it's vital to the life of their shellfish. So social license and acceptability varies, and I think it's a challenge probably in this part of the United States as well, and something we need to pay attention to. Where does this come from? when US aquaculture in general is done right across the United States, where do these perceptions come from? Well, part of this is a problem that agriculture in general faces. We just have a lot fewer farmers than ever before. Most people in the United States have never met a farmer. They have very odd perceptions about what farmers are like and what they do. What's even stranger about all of this is some of the studies on social license show that the word farmer has a positive connotation, but the word farming has a very, very negative connotation. So we have these disconnects in the United States about what we want and what we're doing. Now, if we talk more about, specifically about seafood, we have this other trend that's dramatically changed the whole market in the United States. Seafood used to be what was available, used to be what could be caught locally. That's not the case at all anymore. The major whitefish fishery out of the northern part off the coast of Europe, all of those fish are being caught, or the majority are being caught. They're shipped to Qingdao, China for processing, and then they're reshipped all around the United States. So the advantages in trade and shipping and packaging now have led to a situation of tremendous trade in seafood products. It's led to a case in the United States where we import nearly all the seafood that we eat in the United States. Much of the seafood we're importing is coming from developing nations. A lot of these countries simply don't have the regulatory structure and don't have the enforcement structure to ensure that that product meets the standards coming into a country like the United States. So part of this reality is, again, this disconnect that I'm trying to talk about. Now, if everybody would pay double the price for locally raised seafood, I think we would be fine in the United States. Some people will pay more for locally raised fish and other kinds of products, but not everybody will. The marketing studies that are done of the majority of U.S. consumers still show this, that seafood is sold mostly on price. And so it's something we have to contend with. The volume that can be sold is going to change at different prices, and the price points become all important. We know that aquaculture is not well understood. We know that there are public perceptions that have led to opposition to aquaculture, and so we have sort of this irony going on in the United States. We want environmentally sustainable food. We want safe food in the United States, but we're regulating and over-regulating our U.S. industry to the extent that it's difficult for them to compete on price these days because the imported product is not subject to those same costs, and so they can put it here at a cheaper rate. And so in a sense, U.S. consumers are supporting production practices, and in some cases, like Pangasius and others, are highly unsustainable. So we have these kind of things going on. Let's do just a little math a little bit differently from what John did, but this is looking across the United States. The U.S. population is very high, 300 and some million, 15.5 pounds per capita consumption, without even trying to increase how much we eat per person in the United States. We're looking at demand, effective demand for 5 billion pounds, and U.S. aquaculture production is a very small percentage of that. So what this means is there's enormous potential. We have to deal with the imports. We have to deal with the price differential, though, in the United States. We have tremendous resources. Now, this is probably going to be controversial, but I think of this region, I look at the Great Lakes. What a tremendous resource that we have. I look at all the controversy over net pen salmon production, and what I have seen is that the development and increase in research and understanding of how to site net pens properly and how to monitor them properly and how to do net pen salmon aquaculture in an environmentally sustainable way is just tremendous. That same kind of science I don't hear discussed in freshwater circles. And yet those same kind of methods and models and approaches could be used to look at freshwater resources. When I think about Minnesota, I do think about walleye. I do think about walleye from many, many perspectives. We've all heard about the preferences for walleye here, and not just Minnesota, but people in other states know what a great tasting fish product this is. There's no question. But don't forget that these same kinds of perceptions of aquaculture, and a lot of people are very, very opposed to selling carnivorous fish in general, especially farm-raised carnivorous fish. So as you think about developing aquaculture in Minnesota, you have to think about this, because there are people that are actively advocating for us to only eat fish that are raised low on the food chain, and fish that are really filter feeders and shad and things like that, rather than carnivorous fish species. So there are perceptions out there that can become problematic if an industry begins to grow. Clearly, there's a lot of research on substituting other kinds of protein sources for fish meal. That needs to continue, and it will continue, and we've made tremendous advances in doing this for salmon and other fish species. That's vitally important to this perception of some species. There are a couple of other things that I think are really, really important when you think about starting up a new industry and start up businesses. We have a growing sense among consumers in the United States that they do not want to eat food that's been raised with a lot of antibiotics. We know that. And so by knowing that, startup businesses that focus on biosecurity and have major emphases on biosecurity practices to prevent the introduction of diseases onto their facility, for example, may have a distinct advantage. Development of vaccines has been vital to this as well, to reduce the need for antibiotics. It's important to think about. We're going to be talking later on about research needs. A skilled labor force, and a labor force that wants to do the kind of work that aquaculture requires them to do, is very hard to come by in the United States. It doesn't matter if it's the West Coast or it's Arkansas, Mississippi, or the East Coast. I hear from farmers over and over again that labor and access to labor and people who are willing to really put in a full day's work is hard to come by. One of those solutions is automation. I also see very little research going into automating aquaculture practices, and it's just a thought I throw out there. We are seeing driverless tractors in agriculture. You know, where are driverless, robotic kinds of harvesting systems for aquaponics and others is something I think is worth thinking about. I think there are tremendous opportunities as well for new businesses to take advantage of consumer fears about the safety and freshness and quality, especially of seafood. And there are ways now with smart packaging and with technology that we can use to package in a way that has an indicator of freshness, that has different indicators of the quality of that product right on the packaging itself. There are ways like this that I think we can provide an advantage to what's grown in the United States and really capture some of these recent trends. So I see it as this sort of disconnect, but at the same time, what I see also are some real opportunities emerging. I think that public perceptions of aquaculture are changing. I think they're different from what they were even 10 years ago. We have to work on it, there's no question. We also have to think about this millennial generation. That's a very interesting generation. It's a very large generation. And it's also a generation that's also already exerting its influence in the marketplace. This is a generation that wants quality, not just to the environment, but in this kind of holistic sense. They want quality of life, quality of environment. They want quality in their food. They say they're willing to pay a little bit more. I think they're a major influence behind the demand for local food and other things. But they're a generation that's also very poorly informed about aquaculture, and so it's a generation to contend with. I think they're real opportunities, but how we communicate with them and how we help them see the benefits of US aquaculture, I think, is a real key to being successful these days. At the end of the day, we have to change this paradigm that I've sort of described. We have to move our competition away from price in US aquaculture to compete with imports. We have to change that. The reality is that the majority of US consumers buy their seafood based on price. In spite of what we would like to believe, and in spite of the fact they say they prefer these things, when it comes to putting that money out on the table, they tend to not do it. If people really want locally grown food, if they really want sustainable and safe food, we need to change this paradigm and encourage them to pay a little bit more to prefer US farm-raised products. And with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions. I'll try to answer any questions that you might have with that. Yes, sir.
Just a comment. there's an auto dealer in Des Moines, Iowa that advertises on television, and his theme is that price sells cars. And you commented on the price economics as being very important. In our town, Atlantic salmon, imported Atlantic salmon is $17 a pound, and walleye, Canadian walleye, wild caught walleye from Canada, is $17 a pound. But I can see a problem with that. The two-thirds, the best, what one would consider the highest quality beef is two-thirds of that price. The highest quality beef. So I think we have a problem. You look at the meat counter, and it's 8 foot for the seafood section and 60 feet for the domesticated animal production. So if we want to expand, we have to overcome this price is an issue, a problem.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt, and we can't ignore it. You know, people, you can sell, you know, there are people, well, there are a lot of people raising shrimp indoors these days in the United States. But for example, some of the early ones, when I first started asking, well, what price are they selling it for? They're selling it for $14, $15 a pound. Well, 5 years later, when I said, what are they selling it for? Well, other people got in the business, and so they had to drop their price and all of that. So there are some people who will pay very high prices for certain kinds of things. But how many people are there out there that'll pay that price? And as other people come in, the price gets driven down. And in order to increase the volume, the price has to come down. So we have to be efficient. We have to do it. But we need to move seafood more so than some other products. Seafood is one where people primarily are still buying on price, with some exceptions. Now, to the extent that you can create a brand and create the differentiation, you can charge a higher price. You know, look at what's happening with oysters. It's just amazing. I'm not sure how much oyster prices have increased in the last 10 years, but it's substantial. It's substantial. It's become a thing to go to these oyster bars and have designer oysters, and there's wine that's being paired with oysters, and it's just a real thing that's happening on both coasts, to the benefit of an industry that, if it didn't have such a regulatory burden, would be better able to take advantage of it. We need to do that with seafood and really change the way the U.S. consumer thinks about seafood, and create these different brands and create the value that's already there, but help people understand that to pay a little bit more for it.
Yeah, those are Bruton's question. I know we're talking about predominantly seafood today, but I just wanted to, what are the opportunities, if anything, in Minnesota in this region for ornamental? I used to look at guys in Florida, but I'm just curious about how there.
Sure. Ornamentals, you know, I just looked at the numbers for tropical fish production in Florida, and they actually decreased between the two censuses. They're struggling, and they'll tell you again, it's a regulatory environment. They're also competing with low-priced goldfish and ornamentals coming in out of China. There are lots of concerns there. You start talking about regulations. There's some evidence pointing to the introduction of some fairly major diseases that may be coming in from live ornamentals that are being imported in, that the U.S. ornamental industry has tried to fight against unsuccessfully, for example. But they're struggling with imports as well. And that's, you know, there's some ornamental growers that are doing pretty well, that have created some niches for certain products, but some others are not doing as well. It's sort of the same scenario: imports and lower prices, and a more lax regulatory environment and inspection system for what's being brought into the United States.
Over here, there's a question I didn't see.
I'm Sean Sisler. So I'm wondering, like, is the goal to make our seafood, U.S. grown seafood, I'm talking including fish and everything, competitive with all seafoods throughout the world, or competitive with other products such as beef, chicken, and pork, to make it really a viable industry?
You know, those are important questions for any business to look at and make a decision. I think there are multiple ways to do this. Getting people to eat more seafood has been a tough thing, and there have been several federal programs that have attempted to do this. if they're going to eat more seafood, they're going to switch away from the other center of the plate protein sources. There have been a number of attempts to do this on a national level, and they've not worked for whatever reason. And so I don't think we should give up on those. Seafood is a very healthy thing for people to eat. I think this millennial generation is maybe more receptive to it, maybe. And so I don't think we should give up on it. In my opinion, that's a harder sell and a longer term kind of a thing for that to happen, that I think would be good to happen, and it's a good investment, but it's longer term. In the immediate term, this is a huge market for seafood right now in the United States. It's a huge market with those numbers that I put up there, and only a small percent is coming from US aquaculture. I think concerted efforts to deal with these disconnects, because all of the things that are important to US consumers are being done in US aquaculture right now. And I think the hurdles are sort of this disconnect. If we can connect those dots a little bit better, I think is the shorter term way to approach it. But I would advocate for both lines, one longer term, one shorter term.
Yes, so Carole, one of the beautiful things about U.S. industry is the ability to innovate through applying science, which is basically what Seagrant does. So what I'm asking is, are there kinds of science that would be needed in order to be able to, in fact, compete on price by innovating production systems to drive the cost of production downward, even on some of these species, so we wouldn't be displaced by those who are competing on cost? I mean, sort of the difference between well, mostly disruptive innovation comes about via seeking to sell to consumers that are not consuming. And you have to do a lot of that based on price. So what do you think are the frontiers of science for creating innovation to make the U.S. aquaculture industry more competitive on a world scale?
We could have a long discussion about that, and I think we'll get into that on the research panel. I think some of these things about equipment, I think there's a huge gap in automation in aquaculture, in research for aquaculture equipment innovation, a huge gap right there that could result in savings. The business of reducing losses through vaccines, we have a good idea what biosecurity practices are, but vaccines to avoid disease and things like that are critical. Genetic improvement. You know, we have done this in the United States, and a lot of our innovations are being adopted all around the world. We need to continue to do it. The catfish industry is reinventing itself. It's going to these split pond systems and tripling yields and reducing their costs of production that way. But we have to also deal with this regulatory disconnect between countries overseas, where the Pangasius farmers, because they're allowed to discharge all of their waste into the environment all the time, every day, repeatedly, can raise their product almost at half the cost as we can in the United States, because we don't pollute our environment by discharging. So I think both of those, we need to continue the research investment. And we can have long discussions about those, and we need to do it. But we have to deal with the import situation and the regulatory discrepancy, because our innovations are being adopted all around the world.